Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and this is a change in the way that people thought about the world that happened around the year 1900 that is generally referred to as the Crisis of Modernity. Here are your video goals. By the end of the video, you should be able to explain what the Crisis of Modernity is, talk about how new ideas in science change the way people feel about the world, talk about how ideas about humanity and society change during this time period, how World War I affects the way people think, and how corporations and political leaders use these new ideas to their advantage. So let's get started by just talking generally about what the Crisis of Modernity is. Generally, the Crisis of Modernity can be explained as a shift in the way that Europeans think about the world that starts to happen around the year 1900, so about 14 years before World War I starts. So before 1900, generally, most Europeans were confident that Europeans were great and that human beings were generally rational and that science and technology would make the world better and better as time went on. This is how Europeans had thought about themselves in the world since the Enlightenment. But by around 1900, a lot of people in Europe, especially upper class and middle class people, started to worry that maybe there was something wrong with European society and that things weren't as good as some people said they were. And this feeling of anxiety and concern that things weren't as good as they seemed is called the Crisis of Modernity. And it leads to all sorts of doubts about Western culture and what Europeans are doing with the world. It's made worse by new ideas from the sciences and from the humanities. And it's definitely made worse by World War I, when European societies go to war with each other for really no good reason and destroy their societies. And so as a result of the Crisis of Modernity, you get sort of a new vision of the world. That's kind of the opposite of the really happy vision that the Enlightenment had. And according to this new vision, there is no progress. Things aren't getting better. Reason and science don't make the world a better place. And human beings are now seen as sort of violent and irrational and just bad creatures rather than the good, rational creatures that the Enlightenment thought they were. So some ideas that lead to the Crisis of Modernity come out of science. So in the same way that the old ideas of Isaac Newton and Galileo made people really confident that we could understand the world and make it a better place, new ideas come around the year 1900 that make people question humanity's place in the universe and humanity's ability to understand the world. And so the first thing that happens is that Isaac Newton's ideas of how the physical world works are actually proved wrong. Newton's theories, even though they're super useful, aren't 100% right. And the new ideas that take the place of Isaac Newton's ideas are really weird and confusing and hard to understand. And the most famous one of these new ideas is Einstein's theory of relativity, which basically says that time and space do not exist as we see them in our everyday lives, but rather that they are these sort of very mysterious and complicated ideas that don't really make a lot of sense to the normal person. And this is very unsettling. On top of this, there's all sorts of new technologies being developed. Stuff like X-rays, nuclear power, and the radio. So new, very powerful technologies that normal people don't really understand how they work. And this leads to both new powers for the people who can control these technologies, but also to new dangers. As we've seen in World War I, technology and power can be misused just as much as they can be used. In philosophy, you start to see a sort of a similar movement away from the Enlightenment. So in the Enlightenment, they had a pretty rosy outlook. They thought that societies were formed through a social contract where we all decided to get together and have a government. They thought that human beings tended to be good and rational, and they thought that science and technology would lead to continued progress. And these are all ideas that Jean-Jacques Rousseau held, and that's that smiling dude down there on the left. On the other hand, the thinkers during the Crisis of Modernity started to have a much darker view of humanity. They argued that societies were not based on an agreement, but were rather built on force and violence. They argued that human beings were essentially violent and irrational, that we weren't this good, rational creature that the Enlightenment said we were. We were a lot more like most other animals. And that science and technology actually serve only to increase humanity's ability to destroy. And these are all ideas that are associated with the thinker Friedrich Nietzsche, who you can see down there at the bottom right. So just look at the two different expressions on those guys' faces. And that basically sums up the difference between the Enlightenment and the Crisis of Modernity. And so all of these new ideas were around before World War I. That humans are bad, that technology is evil, and that progress doesn't exist. But World War I makes it worse because it's almost like proof of these theories in a lot of people's minds. There are 16 million people dead, and for what reason? Most people can't say. Because of Franz Ferdinand, because of Serbia. And so for a lot of people, this seems like it's confirming the anxieties and the fears of the thinkers from the Crisis of Modernity. Science and technology made the war worse. European civilization is not better than any other society. In fact, it might be worse than other societies because it thinks it's so great. And individuals and nations are both irrational and started this war for no reason. So this leads people to reject old ways of doing things and to look for new solutions. And so we're going to see after World War I, a lot of people are going to abandon old-style democracies and start looking for new solutions and new forms of government. One really interesting thing is that both companies and governments take the ideas of mass culture and run with them. And you see this in the advertising industry. People used to think that if human beings were rational, that the best way to sell products to them would be to explain to them why one product was better than the other. However, after the Crisis of Modernity, companies learn that human beings are irrational and that they make choices based on emotion and image rather than on rational cost-benefit analysis. And so this leads companies to change the way they advertise, and they no longer make arguments for why their product is good, but they rather just associate their product with other images that people want. And most importantly, they begin associating their items with sex. And you can see there on that image that this cigarette brand, Lucky Strike, is associating its brand with the image of an attractive lady. And the idea is that people will associate in their mind that cigarette brand with pretty ladies. So it's not just corporations, though, that use these new ideas. Governments also use these new ideas. And after World War I, you're going to see a number of governments who give up making rational arguments and instead use sort of wildly untrue historical claims and symbols and emotional rhetoric to get people to vote for them. So just like companies, governments realize that emotion and irrationality is really what motivates people, not Enlightenment ideas. And so we're going to see the rise of a couple governments that use these irrational ideas to gain power. And this is actually a pretty scary trend that leads to the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. That is the Crisis of Modernity. I hope you found that interesting, and we're going to talk a lot more about this tomorrow.